I think there's something wrong with the control that big tech companies hold over American life. If you also feel that way, then not only is this video for you, but you might be surprised to learn that you're in the majority. According to an April 2024 report by Pew, almost 8 in 10 American adults think that social media companies hold too much power, and 5 in 10 support more regulation for major tech companies. But so little is done to address that anger that I would forgive you if you don't believe those numbers. The disconnect between popular anger and government action is very glaring in tech news coverage. If you're like me, and you're not a lawyer or a technologist or an economist, then reading the coverage on this stuff can be pretty irritating. For years, every time I read an article, I'd get tripped up by technical terms and legal jargon. I'd wonder if the suit I was reading about now was the same one that I read about last year, and I'd just get confused as to how all of these judges and lawyers were scratching their chins and going, I wonder if Google's 90% control in the search market is a monopoly? In just my lifetime, we have seen privacy violations, election interference, a mass tragedy for mental health, but the best we can do is ban TikTok. Why? These are big questions though, and I didn't want to answer them alone, so I brought my friend Ale along to provide some perspective.
This is what happens when you tie your webcam to a yogurt can. My name's Alejandro.
He writes a tech blog called The Luddite and is a founder of the tech worker cooperative Interstitial.
I'm interested in the intersection of technology, power, and human agency, really from the perspective of someone who makes tech, which is me. I write code.
I'm just a writer, but he's a writer and an engineer, so I hope his perspective will be illuminating where it's necessary. We'll start in part 1 with the endless list of big tech lawsuits, before moving on in part 2 to discuss their historical origins. In part 3, we'll talk about why I read several hundred pages of antitrust law before getting to part 4, where I will provide a perfect solution to this problem. Please, enjoy the video at your leisure.
I want to talk to you now about 3 lawsuits. I want to give you just the vague outline of them and kind of get your potentially incensed reaction to each of them.
Oh, interesting. I'm in. Let's do this.
Okay. In this first section, I'm going to cover a handful of big tech lawsuits. We won't be able to get to all of them, but that's okay. My goal with this video is that you'll eventually be able to read coverage of these suits on your own, not just regurgitate whatever facts I can fit into the runtime of this video. To do that, we're going to focus on themes and context instead of just brute forcing details. Speaking of which, we need to start with background information. Who is suing who, and why? These suits are brought forward by one of 3 entities: the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, led by Jonathan Cantor, the Federal Trade Commission, chaired by Lena Khan, and state attorneys general offices, which are led by state AGs who represent their state's citizens. And the defendants are the usual culprits: Microsoft, Google, Meta, Apple, and Amazon. There are other firms that I could include in this list under the heading of big tech or tech company, but I'm going to focus solely on the big 5 in this video because of their size. At time of recording, they are the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 7th largest companies on the planet, all worth more than $1 trillion. So we have the government suing tech companies, usually, but that doesn't answer the question, why? Most of these suits are antitrust cases. For those of you unfamiliar with American law, we'll get into the weeds a little bit later, but for now what you need to know is that in America, there is a body of law referred to as antitrust law, the purpose of which is to protect a free and democratic market from private monopolies. There are many antitrust laws, but the most notable are the Sherman Act, which prevents monopolies, the Clayton Act, which prohibits specific anti-competitive behaviors, and the FTC Act, which created the Federal Trade Commission, a federal agency charged with enforcing these laws and regulating trade. And antitrust suits, like the ones we're talking about today, target violations of these laws. They might, for example, go after very large horizontally integrated monopolies. That's when one firm has so much control over a specific market that they're able to bully competition and raise prices. Think, for example, if one company owned 90% of all steel production and was using that power in order to raise steel prices. Or antitrust suits may try to break up vertical integration, which is when one company operates across many layers in the same industry and uses that position to exert control to raise prices and bully competition. Think, for example, in our steel production case, if that company wasn't just involved in production of metal, but if they were also involved in mining and smelting and many other steps in the process. Economists think that monopolies are bad sometimes because they can raise prices and stifle competition. Others have noted that monopolies and anti-competitive behavior create worse working conditions and can lead to income inequality. Antitrust suits attempt to prevent these negative outcomes by breaking up these large firms or changing their behavior. And that's exactly what these suits against tech companies are all about. Let's get into the details. I want to start with an amusing first case, Epic Games v. Apple.
Ooh, Epic Games v. Apple. If I remember correctly, it's something about the Apple App Store being an obvious cartel.
In August of 2020, Epic Games, the creators of Fortnite, released this video accusing Apple of violating antitrust law in the terms of their iOS App Store. The video is parodying a very famous 1984 Mac ad, calling on viewers to resist the repressive regime of Big Brother. Concurrent with the video's release, Epic updated Fortnite so that financial transactions made on the game would begin to bypass Apple's payment processor. Since this was against their developer agreement with Apple, they were pulled from the App Store and a lengthy legal battle ensued.
I submit things to the Apple. It is Apple App Store. It's like an unbelievable, like, I can't believe it. We've allowed it to exist.
You see, apps can only be downloaded onto iOS devices via the App Store, which Apple controls very tightly. iOS app developers are subject to Apple's terms, otherwise their applications can't get onto iPhones. Once there, payment transactions on iOS are only allowed through Apple's payment processor. Apple then takes a 30% cut of all in-app purchases, no ifs, ands, or buts. This means that whenever a player purchased V-Bucks on an iOS device, 30% of that was going to Apple. Epic Games sued under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, claiming that Apple's terms were an abuse of monopoly power. The argument goes that since Apple's market share in smartphones in the US was so large, about 60%, developers need to get their apps onto iOS devices in the App Store in order to succeed. Apple can then exploit this need by making developers agree to strict terms and extracting profits from them. But despite a decent argument, Epic ended up actually losing most of the case. Apple retained complete control over transactions on iOS.
The stuff I've submitted is actually a great example. I do some work with human rights agencies, and we wrote an app. It's for activists in very specific circumstances on the ground in conflict zones. We had a lot of problems with submitting to the App Store. One of the things that they said was, well, why don't you distribute it like as a test app? They were trying to put me in a situation where, like, well, now I have to explain to these activists over their shitty internet in like a conflict zone operating in their like seventh language, right? Through an interpreter, that they need to download an app, but they can't download the app through the App Store because Apple doesn't want it to be in the App Store. So they have to use like this link, and they're like, who the fuck am I? Like, this is a complicated thing to explain. But the entire App Store, like, it's just the internet, except they own it. Like,
Yeah.
their monopoly is so powerful that not only do they have like monopoly, they have like hegemony.
Personally, I think that total control over a marketplace of this size poses anti-competitive concerns, and other similar suits have actually agreed with me on this. But in this case, it went to Apple. If you want to know why, don't worry, we'll get there. I want to go next to a suit against Meta, owners of Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp. They're facing questions about their control of the personal social networking market in a case Federal Trade Commission v. Meta Platforms. Unlike Epic v. Apple, this one has been less than amusing. It's actually been something of a bloodbath. The suit was first filed in December of 2020, but it was dismissed. It then got amended and refiled in 2021 before another dismissal request came, but in 2022, a judge ruled that most of the case could go forward. Concurrent with all of this, Meta went on the offensive against the FTC and Lina Khan, launching a countersuit against their internal hearing structure, and at one point requesting that Khan recuse herself from a case altogether. Then it turned out the ethics official who asked Khan to recuse herself owned Meta stock. How did that happen? Oh my god, so sorry guys. Ethics, ha 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 ha. The suit revolves around Meta's ownership of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, alleging that owning all three of these platforms has given them a monopoly in personal social networking sites. Depending on how you define the social media market, Meta does own quite a large chunk of it, with half of humanity signing into one of Meta's services at least once a month. While a win in this suit would be really huge, I don't bring it up for optimistic reasons. I don't actually think this one is going to go anywhere, at least not yet. I'm bringing it up for a more instructive purpose. I think that this suit is really excellent at demonstrating how procedural and technical questions are more important in these cases than you might think at first. For example, an important question here has been market definitions. If Meta is a monopoly, then there must be a market that they are monopolizing, and we must define it in order to assess if they have a monopoly or not. The FTC has defined this market rather narrowly as personal social networking sites, while Meta thinks that there should be a broader definition used, one that includes competitors like YouTube and TikTok. It's weird to see government lawyers arguing over if YouTube is like Facebook, but that's what we're doing now, I guess.
Like, what they're doing is like actually really straightforward if you're not like lawyer brains about it. Like they obviously have a monopoly. any definition that like puts like Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn has real like okay boomer energy. Like if those are all the same market, then like
Yeah, that's
that's sort
hard.
of being like newfangled kid shit. It's like your definition of this, more or less.
Tech is when my son won't talk to me because he's looking at his phone. Yeah.
We can't even get to the question of if Meta abused monopoly power until this question is answered, though. So when you see a headline that says something like, Meta files motion for summary judgment alleging overly narrow market definitions, it's not just gibberish. Underneath that, there's actually an important technical question that could decide how the case goes. The details matter. The last suit I'll discuss in this section is about Google. The Department of Justice actually has 2 suits going against Google right now, but we're going to focus on one, the recently concluded proceedings of 2020's US v. Google. The suit alleges that Google has used anti-competitive tactics to maintain a monopoly in the search engine space, where they have about 90% control. This case has brought some very interesting behavior to light on the part of Google. For example, that they were paying Apple about $20 billion a year in order to be the default search engine in Safari, an arrangement that some have referred to as monopoly profits paid to distributors. This arrangement has kept smaller search engines from entering the market and has allowed Google to allegedly extort advertisers, since they are the only search engine advertising game in town.
There's a lot of like kind of startup search engines. There's like DuckDuckGo, which I feel like I'm like supposed to like, but it's not actually that good. And there's like Kagi. A lot of these actually like don't even have their own search index. They're just like buying Bing search index. So like even if you like I think a lot of people feel like the Google monopoly is breaking, but that's like not true at all. Like there's still like relatively few people doing like proper search indexes.
At time of recording, it's unclear how this case will go. I personally think that the argument is pretty strong, considering Google's enormous market share. They claim that they maintain that share through a superior product that benefits consumers, but if it benefits consumers so much, why do they need to pay an 11-digit sum every year to keep it top of mind? I bring this suit up because everyone I know who hears about it for the first time has the same question.
What do you know about US v. Google?
Nothing.
Okay, so US v. Google, there's actually 2 US v. Googles. The DOJ is suing Google twice right now. One is for search engine market monopoly.
It's a fucking no-brainer.
How is this not an open and shut case? Why are we confused on what the outcome will be? How is this not a monopoly? It's a good question, but it turns out that the suits are actually just the tip of the iceberg. You may have learned in history class that American antitrust law was once fierce, capable of taking down the giants like Standard Oil, but today it can't deal with Apple, Meta, or Google. Why? As I did more research for this video, I learned that the answer to that question is not in the modern day. In order to answer it, we have to ask ourselves another question. Has anything like this ever happened before?
Something I started to observe was that every successive generation of information technology and communication technology has a monopolist that centralizes power, and then they are broken up, and then a new one comes along in the next technology and centralizes power, and then they're broken up, et cetera, et cetera.
Hey, oh, don't mind me. I'm just reading quotations from the congressional record about tech regulation. You want to hear one? Well, if you insist. This one is interesting. They say that large firms controlling our communications and media have a power greater than any ever wielded, because in an era when public opinion is omnipotent, they can give, withhold, or color the information which shapes that opinion. It may impart an irresistible power. Ain't that the truth? That was said by some guy named Gardiner G. Hubbard in a congressional hearing in the late 1800s? Wait, that can't be right. Wait. Let me try this one. It's some blowhard talking about how much commercial data his big business has access to. It is the nervous system of the commercial system. If you'll sit down with me at my office for 20 minutes, I will show you what the condition of business is at any given time in any locality in the United States. What asshole said that? Probably like Mark Zuckerberg or something. Oh, no. That was from a guy named William Orton, and it's from 1870. Okay, let's try one more. But with all of this preoccupation, remedies remained elusive. Presidents, postmasters general, congressional committees, and individual legislators, in their endless procession of addresses, annual reports, investigations, bills, and speeches, demonstrated that they had no clear idea of what to do or how to do it. I'll drop the bit now. That one was also about 19th century business. Despite their age, I relate to all of these quotes. I see in them the same anxieties that I have about large companies controlling my data and communication. But these quotes weren't about data centers or social media. They were all about the telegraph. It turns out that disruptive tech and the problems it poses aren't all that new. One argument that I hear really often about tech regulation is that we're kind of uniquely doomed in the modern day because our legislators are all too old or too dumb to understand the problems posed by the internet. I understand why this argument appeals to a lot of people.
So how many data categories do you store? Does Facebook store on the categories that you collect?
Senator, can you clarify what you mean by data categories?
I know many very smart people who it appeals to, but I've never really liked it. And I don't like it because I think it lets us get away with understanding that this situation we find ourselves in has historical context that we can draw on. So to try and convince you that there's nothing new under the sun, I want to tell you about the first tech and media monopoly in American history, a telegraph company called Western Union, and their bilateral monopoly with the Associated Press. Perhaps you've heard of the telegraph before. An invention of Samuel Morse, who first tested his idea in front of Congress in 1838, it used long wires and his Morse code as the first form of instantaneous electric telecommunication. I actually did another video recently on the birth of the telegraph if you want more detail. One of my major sources for that video and for this one is this book, The Creation of the Media by Paul Starr. Starr's thesis is that technology and economics alone cannot explain media history in terms of the media that we have today or the media that succeeded in the past. He argues that once a new technology exists, it's not destined to behave in any specific way. If we want to understand how a new technology will shape society then, we have to look at the ways that political power and decisions interfaced with that technology. For the telegraph, political concerns emerged almost instantly after its invention. Cool, we have these magic wires that are going to let us talk to everyone all over the world, but who is going to own and operate them? Congress had initially given Morse a small sum of about $30,000 to test the telegraph, but they ultimately failed to either purchase or nationalize it, opting instead to leave it to the private sector. This led to a flurry of early investment with as many as 50 different telegraph companies as of 1851. But despite this early story of competition, the history of the telegraph would eventually become intertwined with the history of just one company. In 1856, two telegraph companies merged to form a new firm, Western Union. Right out of the gate, Western Union played really hard, utilizing exclusive deals with railroad companies to make it so that only Western Union wires could run alongside their tracks. From this fortified market position, they were eventually able to purchase competitors until by 1866, just 10 years after their formation, they had gained a nearly complete monopoly on the telegraph in the United States. Starr actually refers to the success of Western Union as the first national monopoly of any kind to emerge out of a previously competitive industry. When people talk about the birth of Antitrust and the Gilded Age, they usually talk about it in terms of manufacturing giants like Standard Oil. But none of those firms could have existed in the way that they did without Western Union. One of the quotes that I read at the top of this section was by William Orton. As president of Western Union in 1870, he had access to a treasure trove of information about business in the United States because everyone was using Western Union, and he could see how well they were doing by how much they were spending on telegrams. He had commercial analytics, an early form of big data. All the big players went through Western Union, and he knew what they were up to. Their monopoly position ended up being so strong that they were able to control almost everything about the telegraph in the United States. For example, raising prices and restricting it mostly to commercial use. As one primary source from 1881 noted, the average price paid per message in the United States is over 38 cents for 10 words, according to the official reports of the Western Union Company. In England, the average charge of all messages sent for the past year was but 27 cents for 20 words. This suggests to me that prices didn't have to be as high as they were under Western Union. In Britain, for example, the telegraph was cheaper and more widely available to the public, despite being the same technology. That's because the reason for these differences was policy. In Britain, the telegraph was nationalized, owned by the post office, while in America it was owned by a private monopoly. These two different conditions led to different outcomes for consumers. It was a natural case study. I want to make clear here that I'm not necessarily arguing for nationalization in this section. I'm just trying to point out that different political decisions led to different outcomes with the same technology. A nationalized telegraph kept rates low and treated messages equally, whereas Western Union, a private monopoly, did not. The lesson isn't that nationalization is good per se, but rather that different political decisions led to different outcomes. More on this later. At the same time that Western Union gained absolute control over the Telegraph, they inked an exclusive deal with another important ally that you may recognize, the Associated Press. Technically, it was the predecessors to the modern AP, but that wasn't as dramatic. They do news. They're very important. You know about them. The system was foolproof. The Associated Press used their exclusive access to the Telegraph to collect national and international news, which they would use to write their columns and distribute them back out to their many franchise member papers. They kept the franchise member papers in line with bylaws, most notably a bylaw that forbid them from taking news from any source other than the Associated Press. This bound franchise member papers to print what the Associated Press wrote. Smaller papers that weren't franchised with the AP would struggle to keep up. Without access to the Telegraph, without access to the only form of instantaneous telecommunication, they couldn't get national or international news in a timely fashion like the Associated Press did. This was something of a deal with the devil that the Associated Press made with Western Union. By getting exclusive access to the Telegraph, they had better news than anyone else. But that agreement came with terms. In return for this, Western Union gained control over what the Associated Press printed, notably insulating themselves from criticism. The AP was contractually bound not to promote an alternative telegraph, which effectively meant that the AP, the most important news service in the world, could not speak in disparaging terms of the Western Union Company. As one of my quotes from the top of this section put it, "In an era when public opinion is omnipotent, Western Union can give, withhold, or color the information which shapes that opinion. It may impart an irresistible power." So they controlled the media, and it was kind of perfectly legal. One amusing example that I found came in 1883, when one senator made a speech railing against Western Union. The AP, in their coverage of the speech, didn't want to anger Western Union, and so they simply wrote, "Senator Hill spoke on the Postal Telegraph Bill." Because of all these exclusive deals and anti-competitive arrangements, smaller papers didn't have access to the Telegraph. Papers franchised with the AP could only write what the AP told them to write, the AP couldn't criticize Western Union, and Western Union did as it pleased. In its heyday, this was a bilateral monopoly, a tech company owned by the richest man on the planet, exercising control over commercial data, information, and communications. Do I need to draw out the comparison any clearer here? Eventually, the times caught up, and we saw the birth of Antitrust with the Sherman Act in 1890. One of the successes of the Sherman Act that many of my sources pointed to was that it was effective at capturing the public discontent that people felt towards these massive trusts, and their desire for the government to do something about it. That history reflects a frustration that I think is similar to the one we experience today. For average Americans, antitrust wasn't some theoretical idea about how to structure a perfectly efficient economy. It was the means by which they freed themselves from the reins of monopoly power. They got together and wrote laws that said, "We don't like this, and it should stop now." I don't mean to say that the solution is as simple as copying our ancestors. We already have the Sherman Act, and clearly it's not helping us out right now. What I'm trying to get across is that we aren't uniquely doomed. Every generation has had a new problem with technology that they have had to use the law to account for. Some of the largest technology companies in American history have been broken up via antitrust. Western Union, AT&T, Microsoft, all of these had massive legal action brought against them that bettered Americans' lives.
I'm going to draw a lot from my pal Philip Ager on this one. I'm particularly fond of something he wrote about the internet revolution. And his sort of argument, which I think is instructive here, is that there is no such thing as a technological revolution. Technologies are not revolutionary in and of themselves. Revolutions are things that happen in institutions. And there's a constant, we're forever in renegotiations of power within human institutions. And what technologies do is that they change power balances. They change what's possible, like within human institutions.
I bring all of this together to say that the historical case for taking action is very strong. The question then shouldn't be if we're going to do something. It should be, what are we going to do? And seriously, why haven't we done something yet? Why haven't we done antitrust? Why?
This was the way antitrust worked for a really long time until in the 70s, this guy, Robert Bork, came along.
Good old Bork.
Yeah, good old fucking Robert Bork. He wrote this book, The Antitrust Paradox.
Oh, no. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That looks like it hurt.
It did. I really pulled my punches in the script of the video, but this was one of the most displeasurable reading experiences I have ever had in my life.
Do you ever just think about Watergate? On November 17th, 1973, among a bunch of scandals, Nixon gave this speech where he infamously said,
"Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook."
Just a month before this speech, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon had ordered the Attorney General to fire Special Counsel Archibald Cox. Cox was investigating the Watergate break-ins and was demanding access to the incriminating Oval Office tapes that would implicate Nixon in the break-in. Nixon didn't like this, so he ordered the Attorney General to fire Cox. But when he ordered this, the Attorney General didn't do it. He refused and resigned. Nixon then turned to the Deputy Attorney General and asked him to fire Cox, but he also refused and resigned. This left the Solicitor General as the highest-ranking official at the Justice Department, and when Nixon asked him to fire Cox, he did it. Within a month, this was ruled to be an illegal firing outside of the president's power to demand, and this whole snafu with all of its firings and resignations became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
The Saturday Night Massacre ruined Nixon. It was so bad for his popularity, terrible for his approval ratings. But in the background, a new conservative darling was born. The Solicitor General, who had agreed to fire Archibald Cox, would turn out to be a relatively prominent legal thinker for conservatism, and his name was Robert Heron Bork. You may recognize Bork from his contentious failed Supreme Court nomination in the 80s. He had a lot of really wild views on race and free speech and many, many other subjects that we don't have time to cover today. But what we do have time for is this: his 1978 book, The Antitrust Paradox. This book lays out Bork's interpretation of how the courts should interpret antitrust law. I read it because I didn't want to be accused of misrepresenting him in this video, but spoiler alert, I disagree with his theory quite a bit. Bork summarizes his view this way: the only goal that should guide interpretation of the antitrust laws is the welfare of consumers. In judging consumer welfare, productive efficiency, the single most important factor contributing to that welfare, must be given due weight, along with allocative efficiency. The law should be reformed so that it strikes at three classes of behavior: the suppression of competition by horizontal agreement, horizontal mergers creating very large market shares, and deliberate predation engaged in to drive rivals from a market. To rephrase, he thinks that antitrust is a solely economic doctrine, and that its guiding principles should be to create a productive, efficient economy that allocates resources effectively and makes the most goods possible, that makes the most value, and distributes it to people. Or to rephrase again, he really only thinks that the goal of antitrust law is to make sure that the economy gets bigger or that consumer prices stay low. Downstream of that idea, he ends up believing that only a very specific subset of problems are within the scope of antitrust law: cartels, very large horizontal mergers, and a few other types of specific predation. He brushes off a lot of what was previously considered anti-competitive behavior as not a big deal. Conglomerates, vertical mergers, predatory price cutting, barriers to entry. He doesn't really think that these things exist, and if they do exist, he doesn't think that they matter. According to his theory, these shouldn't be litigated under antitrust law because they wouldn't create a bigger economy. He thinks they're outside the scope of the law. Bork also believed that antitrust law shouldn't be used to protect small businesses or to prevent income inequality. He essentially believes that these things are moral concerns, grandstanding by his opponents, and that they don't actually matter to antitrust. He doesn't care if one megacorporation comes to own a market, as long as they have grown the economy and kept prices low for consumers. It's of no concern to Bork if that suppresses wages, reduces the power of labor, creates income inequality, or prevents Americans from owning and operating their own small businesses.
We got this really, really, really lax antitrust regime that just cares about price and output. Yeah. I see you're like smiling along. Do you have anticipations like, about where it ends? Yeah,
it's just the most like bourgeois story. Like it's very liberal. It's just like, oh, people used to care about things like morals, and that's silly. We should stick to the facts. It's like, fuck you.
This approach is generally referred to as the consumer welfare standard, or the Chicago School, and it's been the dominant theory in antitrust for a while now. Bork's theories would eventually get directly cited by the Supreme Court and the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and today a supermajority of the Supreme Court subscribes to the consumer welfare standard. In the last 40 years, antitrust has been relatively inactive as a result. more permissive of large mergers and the consolidation of megacorporations. And we've seen the results of that. If you've ever seen those charts that show that 4 companies control everything in the world or something like that, yeah, you can thank Robert Bork. Bork's theory claimed that it would make a bigger, more efficient economy that would trickle the wealth down to everyone, but instead left us with glaring wealth inequality, the largest corporations in history, and a court unwilling to break them up. One piece I found particularly compelling on the subject shows how this is unpopular, has increased the power of lobbyists, and hasn't even helped the economy. Great. I'm frustrated by this, but thankfully I'm not alone in critiquing Bork. One of the most notable criticisms of Bork is that he gets the history of antitrust wrong. He claims that the Sherman Act was an economic prescription intended solely for consumer welfare, and that things like protecting small businesses or preventing income inequality are historically outside of the scope as it was intended. But that isn't true. The legislators who wrote the Sherman Act worried a lot about the political and social impacts of big business, not just the economic ones. People in the 1880s weren't engaged in some abstract exercise attempting to structure a perfectly efficient economy. They had really real concerns about what monopoly power would do to labor, information, and government. As John Sherman, of the Sherman Act, himself put it, "If we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade, with power to prevent competition and to fix the price of any commodity." When Bork says that antitrust was designed solely for consumer welfare, he's just wrong. We shouldn't accept his analysis since it's based on an ahistorical understanding of the law. Shit, did I just do originalism? In the last decade, this critique has been central in a new view on antitrust, a market structure approach pioneered by Lina Khan. Khan is now the chair of the FTC, but back in 2017, as a law student, she published a note called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. In it, she argued against Bork, using Amazon as an example to show that predatory pricing, vertical integration, and other abusive behaviors that Bork brushed aside are harmful. In her words, this note argues that the current framework in antitrust, specifically its pegging competition to consumer welfare, defined as short-term price effects, is unequipped to capture the architecture of market power in the modern economy. We cannot cognize the potential harms to competition posed by Amazon's dominance if we measure competition primarily through price and output. The classic example is Amazon Basics. You see, Amazon runs a market platform, but they're also a seller on that platform, and that poses some interesting concerns. Say in a hypothetical, you make diapers and want to sell them on Amazon. You have to give them information about those diapers, like how they're made. Amazon also gets to see how much you sell them for and how many people buy. They then use that info to enter the market with an Amazon Basics diaper that looks quite a bit like yours. They drop their price in a way that you simply can't compete with until one day you're forced to sell your business to Amazon. And for those of you that think that hypothetical was kind of far-fetched or overreaching, it's not even that hypothetical. Amazon did almost this exact same thing to a brand called Quidsi between 2009 and 2011.
Part of why that's happening is because when you start an internet company, you compete with every other internet company, right? You're not your local bagel shop. For marketplaces specifically, I think there is such a cutthroat race to the bottom. What they're getting isn't necessarily, like, maybe they won't boost prices, but they are completely strangleholding our infrastructure for goods.
Khan notes that there are 2 antitrust concerns at play in a situation like this. First are questions of vertical integration. You see, Amazon is a seller on the platform, but they also own the platform. This gives them a competitive advantage, like information, that others don't have access to and poses anti-competitive concerns for selling on their marketplace. And second is predatory pricing. Amazon is so large that they can take a hit in sales on diapers for a few months if it means they'll eventually drive a competitor out of business and get to control the diaper market themselves. Their goal isn't necessarily short-term profit, but rather long-term market control. These are both concerning, but bringing a suit against Amazon for this behavior has become really difficult in the last 40 years. Under the consumer welfare standard, and more specifically Justice Kennedy's recoupment test, you actually wouldn't win the case if you proved that Amazon drove Quidsi out of the market. That alone isn't sufficient according to the court. To have a real shot at disciplining Amazon for this, you'd also need to prove that they were going to use their new market control to raise diaper prices and recoup their loss. This is the consumer welfare standard in action. When we focus so singularly on price and output, we cease to care that Amazon drove a competitor into the ground. The law is no longer willing to perceive that as a problem, even though it once did. The standard for winning a suit is higher, and so more predatory behavior is permitted. This gets especially tricky when we consider that forgoing short-term profit in exchange for market control is a core tactic of Amazon's. Khan demonstrates that with this graph, which shows Amazon's ever-increasing market cap compared to their meager profits. Their goal is control, but since the courts only care about rising prices, they don't get punished for this. So Khan argues that we need to rethink antitrust in order to capture concerns like this. When price alone can't capture all anti-competitive behavior, we must adapt. This is actually the main reason that I disliked reading this book so much. Bork, in his theory and his writing, is incredibly arrogant. He thought that his economic assumptions would be true across markets, time periods, and societies. This leads his ideas to be inflexible, and it makes him incorrect about the outcomes. And so we're left with his theory that treats us as consumers first instead of as citizens. It's the ultimate domination of people by capital, where our laws and rights are not about collectively constructing a free society, but are instead protections for the goods that we can hope to purchase.
It kind of seems like it was a little bit ahead of his time, maybe, and this just like ghoulish, like bourgeois, like amorality. The lieutenant governor of Texas was like, grandma should die for the economy or whatever during COVID.
Yeah.
It's the same strain of thinking.
Same thing,
it's just
same
like
thing.
this
Yeah.
amoral, we exist to serve the economy, not the other way around. It's just whatever.
So when we ask why we haven't regulated big tech, when we wonder how these suits that seem like slam dunks are still open questions, this is why.
When I go to write criticism like I'm writing in this piece, I have this voice in the back of my head that is like, you're not the guy to do this. Like, this stuff is actually very complex and you are dumb, so why are you talking?
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that voice.
Okay, well that's not the turn I was expecting.
I've really struggled to write a conclusion to this video. I've rewritten it probably 6 or 7 times in the last 6 months, every time going back for new books, new articles, trying to learn more, convincing myself that I was not prepared to speak on this topic yet, or that I wasn't allowed to. Eventually, however, I learned that that feeling of inadequacy was a valuable lesson on its own. Before we get to that, though, I want to make a point really clear on all this antitrust stuff. If you're ever wondering how a case like US v. Google is hard to decide, or why so many of these suits have failed in the past, it's because of all the history that we just covered with Robert Bork. He led a shift in antitrust that made it harder to win suits, and so less antitrust action has been taken in the last 50 years. Because of this, antitrust hasn't been on the table for big tech like it was for previous generations of technology. The zeal that led to the breakup of firms like Standard Oil has been abstracted out into a technocratic legal debate that the public doesn't feel like they can participate in. This type of thinking is everywhere if you learn to look for it, and our modern tech moguls have certainly learned to benefit from it.
Everyone knows that Facebook contributed to like election disinformation.
Yeah.
But that harm is not like, who's going to sue? What's the, like, we don't, that harm is like illegible to the legal system. And like in some ways, the tech industry, their main innovation is being illegible to regulatory apparatuses.
One interesting note that Lina Khan makes in Amazon's antitrust paradox is that it almost seems that Jeff Bezos designed Amazon perfectly to evade antitrust. In some ways, the story of Amazon's sustained and growing dominance is also the story of changes in our antitrust laws. Due to a change in legal thinking and practice in the 1970s and 1980s, antitrust doctrine views low consumer prices alone to be evidence of sound competition. By this measure, Amazon has excelled. It is as if Bezos charted the company's growth by first drawing a map of antitrust laws, and then devising routes to smoothly bypass them. With its missionary zeal for consumers, Amazon has marched toward monopoly by singing the tune of contemporary antitrust. The reason figures like Jeff Bezos can create firms of this size is because they are allowed to. The boring realization I've come to is that modern tech companies are just products of their environment. When we lax up on antitrust, we shouldn't be surprised when the companies get really big. When we have no data privacy, we shouldn't be surprised when harvesting our data becomes the biggest business in town. The rules of our society are perfectly designed for tech companies to flourish, and so they've become massive. So when we look at solutions, I would, of course, love to see a win in a case like US v. Google. But we have to recognize that the era in which lawsuits transformatively redefine our rights for the better has been over in America for a very long time. You won't wake up one day to learn that one suit worked, that the government won, and everything is going to be better now. It won't happen. Though I find Lina Khan's theories compelling, she has been losing a lot in her tenure at the FTC. She's failed to block a couple notable mergers by Microsoft and Meta. She's gotten a lot of bad press, and so now she's been on a huge media kick, trying to save face by stating her case on Jon Stewart and a litany of podcasts. She's even had to adapt her legal strategy accordingly. The FTC's recent suit against Amazon, for example, is far less ambitious than what she outlined in Amazon's antitrust paradox. She's focusing on very narrow features of Amazon's business model to show that they've caused price increases. She's trying to make a case on Bork's arguments to get a win. It turns out that when you try and bring progressive antitrust suits in front of a conservative federal judiciary that's been doing antitrust one way for several decades, it's pretty hard to change their minds. And so this is one of those weird instances where I really support the actions of the federal government. Our legislators and regulators have been ineffective at representing the discontent we feel, but Lina Khan is actually doing something about it. I have a lot of problems with the Biden admin, but Lina Khan is not one of them, and I hope we do some antitrust. But when it comes to how we diagnose and propose solutions for massive problems like this, the process of writing this video has made clear to me that this wouldn't fix everything. In this way, why haven't we regulated big tech is kind of a misleading question. The problem is so complex that no single solution will ever suffice. If we really want to claim we're representing the anger of the people, we'd have to do so much more than just antitrust. We need to talk about right to repair, intellectual property, artificial intelligence, data privacy. It all needs to be on the table. This video won't end with me describing a perfect solution, because I think any attempt that I could offer at that would fail. I learned this after reading a bunch of comments on my recent video about streaming services. In that video, I made a similar claim to the one that I'm making now, that I had concerns about regulators being unable to act on new technology. But this stance got me a lot of negative response from varying points on the political spectrum. On the one hand, I got a lot of comments from people calling me a state-loving Fed, too naive to understand that regulation is never the answer. This was weird to me because these were people who were ostensibly angry at a tech company like I was. They were watching a 36-minute video about the declining quality of streaming services after all. And yet, their solution was to leave it to the free market, to let them run wild, and it'll sort itself out. I've done a lot of thinking about this since, and I'm happy to report that I no longer take these people seriously. At a basic level, I think that an idealized view of the free market is just naive. David Graeber makes a really good case for this in the introduction to The Utopia of Rules, where he points out that an unregulated market is kind of an oxymoron. You can't have a market without regulation. There wouldn't be stocks, bonds, currencies, etc. without rules that define them. Criticizing specific regulations makes sense and is often appropriate, but fetishization of the free market is just nonsense. I reject it for its simplicity. At the same time, I got a lot of comments from people on the left saying that I failed to understand the real problem. Capitalism. Why regulate a market when markets have such bad incentives? Shouldn't we just tear it all down and start again? I'm more sympathetic to this take. I've made it many times. Capitalism has really obvious problems. For example, I don't think Instagram would be as problematic towards mental health as it is if it weren't for their need to satiate the bloodlust of advertisers and shareholders. But if I worked my way through all of this history and theory and told you this whole story about the rise and fall of antitrust and got to the end and said, oh, and by the way, there's a really good solution. It's to end capitalism. Would that be satisfying? Would that be a good ending to this video essay? If you believe that governments should work for people, then we need to be willing to seek specific policy solutions that will allow them to do so. I want to be clear that I'm not interested in any both sidesism here. I think that most serious solutions would end up pushing us away from capitalism, but socialism doesn't come with good tech policy baked into it. To borrow from Unlearning Economics, I'm not going to end this video by going,
and that's why capitalism is bad.
When you hear this kind of like appeal to I'm not qualified or I don't know enough or it is illegible to me, what do you want to say to someone like that? Like, what are the roadblocks that you think you could clear for them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually have a very simple answer, which is it's a trap. You don't have to understand everything about the world to want it to be different. And the real fight is not articulating exactly what how the world should be different, but convincing everyone to agree on like our shared moral imperative. And I don't have all the solutions to it, but I do really want to convince enough of us to do something about it. You see this deployed all the time in like wars, right? Like I do a bunch of work in human rights, and people, especially American Democrats, love to do this. They'll say like activists, like we shouldn't have drones. And then Obama will be like, well, it's like super complicated. It's not though. I think we shouldn't kill people with sky robots. You shouldn't let people use the fact that the world is complicated to like hammer you, to like dismiss you like that. And I think like, be like, I don't give a fuck how complicated it is. No genocide in Gaza. I'm against it, like categorically.
As I did more research for this video over the last 6 months, I began to feel more and more unqualified to make this video because I couldn't see a way through the problem. And I think that insecurity is what makes simple solutions like free market or end capitalism so appealing. But I don't think we should let ourselves off the hook that easily. Tech regulation isn't one of those subjects where you can watch one video essay and walk away feeling educated and good about yourself. If you came here looking for an answer that you could tell your friends, I'm sorry because I came here to disappoint you. If you want to know why we haven't regulated big tech, it's because we would have to rethink everything. Our ability to craft a society is not yet mature enough to account for the constant tumult of new technology. Antitrust was a great attempt at this. It solved problems for several generations, but it clearly isn't enough anymore. And so the most important thing I learned in making this video is that making it was not the end of my work. And I hope you don't think that watching it is the end of yours. Oh, and also, fuck Robert Bork.